Good evening and welcome to Washington, D.C. I'm Bear Grylls. Tonight I'd like to invite you to join me on a journey through time, over the last 75 years of military history, as we meet ordinary Americans who in extraordinary times rose to become heroes and legends. From World War II to the present day, these are the stories that inspire us, that bring us together and remind us what we're capable of at our very best. Tonight we will spotlight men and women from all backgrounds, all ages and all eras who share a common bond. When they were called upon, they rose to the challenge, and all for a cause much greater than themselves. Welcome to American Valor, a salute to our heroes.
There are stories that inspire us, unite us, that bring out the best in all of us. Everyday Americans in extraordinary situations. Americans who become heroes. Americans who become legends. Join us as we share the story of American valor from across the generations. From Washington, D.C., our nation's capital and headquarters of our military, this is American Valor, a salute to our heroes. Featuring stories of American heroes from George Clooney, Tom Cruise, Morgan Freeman, Mel Gibson, Ellie Kemper, Diane Lane, Liam Neeson, Mike Rowe, Gary Sinise. With special introductions from Margaret Brennan, James Badge Dale, Carolina Kirkova, James Matteo. And now, please welcome once again your host for the evening, Bear Grylls.
One of the great honors of my life was having the privilege to serve with the British military with 21 SAS. And it has allowed me to see firsthand the incredible dedication and friendship between our two countries. Perhaps at no time in history has our special relationship been so vital to protecting freedom around the world than during the Second World War, 75 years ago. And that is where our story begins. Introducing our first story of valor, please welcome the lead from the acclaimed miniseries The Pacific and star of 13 Hours and the newly released Only the Brave, Mr. James Badge Dale.
Good evening. 75 years ago, the world was at war. Imperial Japanese forces controlled vast stretches of China and East Asia. Its sights were now set on expanding deep into the Pacific. In Europe, Nazi armies had conquered nearly the entire continent, from Norway to the Mediterranean, from France in the west, and now parts of Russia in the east. Hitler reigned supreme. But all was not lost. In a miracle at Dunkirk, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops were evacuated to Britain, which survived to fight another day. Its new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, vowed to fight on. He inspired his countrymen to resist the Nazis in the skies over Britain and on its beaches. Churchill implored them to stay in the fight until the New World, the United States, stepped forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. The United States would enter the war half a world away with the attack on Pearl Harbor, but its true first step in liberating the world came 6 months later, in June 1942, near a small island in the Pacific, a battle that turned the tide of World War II. Sharing the story of a brave band of sailors and pilots that changed the course of a war is Tom Cruise.
December 7th, 1941. At 7:48 a.m. local time, a wave of Imperial Japanese fighters and bombers appeared in the skies above the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Achieving complete surprise, their attack would cripple the Pacific Fleet, sinking and damaging 8 battleships. It destroyed nearly 200 aircraft and killed more than 2,400 Americans. Yet amid the destruction, hope remained. At sea during the attack were the Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise. a moment of fortune that would have a major impact on the course of the war the United States now found itself fighting. The days, weeks, and months following Pearl Harbor proved desperate times. Across the Pacific, the Allies were on the retreat. Reeling, the Allies rallied their surviving forces. On April 18, 1942, the U.S. struck back as Jimmy Doolittle led a surprise raid on military targets within mainland Japan, providing a tremendous boost in morale across America. More importantly, the Doolittle Raid shocked the Imperial Military Command. To prevent further raids, the victor of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was tasked with expanding the Japanese defensive perimeter and destroying the surviving American aircraft carriers. His plan: lure the carriers into a trap, then occupy a small American atoll at the far end of the Hawaiian Islands known as Midway. Yamamoto counted on the element of surprise as his forces steamed toward Midway. He dispersed his fleet with the plan of using those ships undetected by the Americans to destroy whatever forces may come to Midway's relief. Unknown to Yamamoto was the fact that the Americans had recently cracked the Japanese naval code and were aware of his plans. 4:30 a.m., June 4th, 1942. Imperial Japanese carrier-based bombers and fighters launched from their decks to attack Midway Atoll. The first wave would cause extensive damage, but the American airbase on Midway remained intact. American bombers had begun their attack on the Imperial fleet. Confusion set in among the Japanese command, which could not decide whether to commit to a second attack on Midway or to target the American fleet just spotted by scouts. This indecision proved devastating, as a new round of American planes were now en route to the Japanese carriers. Though the initial attack did little damage, they kept the Japanese carriers off guard and drew their air defenses out of position. Meanwhile, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers that launched from the Enterprise in Yorktown were having difficulty locating the Japanese fleet. Short on fuel, Squadron Commander Wade McCluskey decided to continue the search rather than return to his carriers. It was a decision that would turn the tide of the war. By luck or fortune, the dive bombers arrived at a perfect moment. As armed Japanese aircraft filled the decks while being refueled, the Imperial carriers were extraordinarily vulnerable. At 10:22 a.m., the dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown commenced their attack. Within minutes, the Japanese carrier Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were ablaze. Hiryu, the last remaining Japanese carrier, counterattacked, its bombers pounding the severely damaged but resilient Yorktown. Late in the afternoon, one of Yorktown's scout planes located Hiryu, prompting Enterprise to launch a final assault. Despite a strong defense, Hiryu was irreparably damaged, sinking the following morning. By the evening of June 4th, 1942, it was evident that the Americans had won a great victory. The Japanese had lost all 4 carriers, a cruiser, and almost 250 aircraft. Yorktown was eventually sunk. Still, Enterprise and Hornet survived, and the United States still held Midway. The victory at Midway has been called the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. From that moment on, it was the United States that would be on the offensive. Victory in the Pacific theater of World War II would still be years away, through terrible fighting on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. And yet, that ultimate victory would not have been possible without the gallant stand in the face of long odds of a band of Americans at a small Pacific atoll 75 years ago.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome surviving veterans of the epic battle that changed the course of World War II, the heroes of Midway.
Welcome, gentlemen. Sir, you served aboard the USS Enterprise.
Yes, sir.
Take us back to that day at Midway.
It was good and it was bad. They had us outnumbered 4-2. Then the Yorktown came along. And in the final analysis, what a battle we won.
And so you were forced to abandon ship when the Yorktown
Yes,
was
I was.
mortally damaged. Did you expect to survive?
Well, I was awfully young. I never even thought about it. I was very confident that I'd get picked up, yes.
And sir, when did you realize that this was going to be a victory?
I happened to be a Pearl Harbor survivor. When I went to Midway, May 26, 1942, I went with the hopes and the thoughts that this would be revenge. And the end result, we got revenge.
The Battle of Midway is still unappreciated, with one exception. The Battle of Midway is celebrated properly at the Naval Academy every year.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. Ladies and gentlemen, once more, the heroes of Midway.
Veterans United Home Loans salutes the heroes of Midway. When we return to American Valor, a salute to our heroes. Morgan Freeman and Margaret Brennan honor a legend of the Tuskegee Airmen. American Valor, a salute to our heroes, presented by Northrop Grumman, is sponsored in part by American Airlines, proud to be the official airline of American Valor, a salute to our heroes. American Valor is produced by the American Veterans Center, guarding the legacy and honoring the sacrifice of American heroes of every generation. To learn more, visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org.
On behalf of Northrop Grumman Corporation and our 65,000 employees, we thank and recognize all of our veterans, past and present. We are proud to again sponsor this program, honoring and thanking our military men and women across generations. The particular heroes we honor here have demonstrated valor above and beyond the call of duty. Honoring the legacy, experiences, and sacrifices of our veterans and active duty service members is a privilege and an imperative. Now, to all of you, please enjoy the show.
Welcome back to American Valor, a salute to our heroes. Joining us to share another story of valor from the Second World War, please welcome CBS White House and Senior Foreign Affairs Correspondent and proud spouse to a United States Marine, Margaret Brennan.
Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. 16 million Americans served in the United States military during World War II. They came from different places and backgrounds, but they were united in their cause. The need for capable men and women also created new opportunities. Old barriers gave way to talent, as a new band of American fighter pilots proved to their countrymen and to themselves that they were more than worthy to fight for the cause. Sharing the story of one of these young trailblazing pilots is Morgan Freeman.
The pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group were indeed skilled and experienced. They had to be. Their story began 3 years earlier when 13 recruits reported for training in Tuskegee, Alabama. To date, no black man had been allowed to serve as a pilot in the United States military, a policy they were determined to change. Training was intense, and the men welcomed it. They knew they were making history. A new unit was formed, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American combat pilots in U.S. history. In attack formation, the P-51s began their strafing run. Bringing up the vulnerable rear position was 22-year-old Alexander Jefferson, who was already flying his 19th combat mission. Jefferson let loose a burst of fire, flying no more than 50 feet above his target. Suddenly, the plane shook with a loud blast. Fire and smoke filled the cockpit as he saw a giant hole in the canopy above, flames licking his boots from the fire below. The P-51 inverted at about 800 feet, and Jefferson was thrown from the plane. Seeing the plane crash into flames, his comrades reported Lieutenant Jefferson killed in action, news his parents would receive soon after. Falling from the sky, Lieutenant Jefferson immediately opened his chute. Hitting the ground, he looked up to find a rifle in his face. In German, a soldier said to him, "Yes, Lieutenant, for you, the war is over." After interrogation, Jefferson was moved to the infamous Stalag Luft III, the prison camp for Allied air officers. There, he was drafted by a group of white prisoners to bunk with them. They could tell from the color of his skin he could not be a German spy. It was a welcome change for the young officer. In time, the prisoners of Room 8, Block 128 grew closer. They had come from all backgrounds. A few guys from the South, a few from Brooklyn, a Jewish man. Lieutenant Jefferson passed the time drawing and eventually made a coat of arms for his bunkmates. Semper in excretia was their motto, always in excrement. In the spring of 1945, as Russian forces advanced on Germany, the prisoners were marched west to another camp. On April 29, 1945, American tanks arrived at the gates. Thousands of American prisoners were liberated, Alexander Jefferson among them. On June 7th, a ship ferrying victorious American troops steamed into New York Harbor. Brothers in battle hugged while singing at the top of their lungs. Spirits rose even higher as they passed the Statue of Liberty and pulled into dock. They were home. A jubilant Alexander Jefferson stepped from the ship. Then he heard the order. The returning Americans, the victors of World War II, were to be segregated. White men to one side, black men to the other. A bit of Lieutenant Jefferson's joy was lost. Some battles had yet to be won. After the war, the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen grew. The military was eventually desegregated and new heroes emerged, dedicated to ensuring that America become the best version of itself. Their struggle, and our continued American struggle, was inspired by a pioneering band of brothers who more than 75 years ago took to the skies and demonstrated that self-evident truth, that all men are created equal.
Ladies and gentlemen, combat pilot with the legendary Tuskegee Airmen in World War II, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Jefferson.
Sir, tell us what it means to represent such a legendary group of men, the Tuskegee Airmen.
I'm simply a survivor. It's fascinating and an obligation to all the men that we left in the soil of France and Germany, the real heroes.
And tell us why the mission of the Tuskegee Airmen was so important for America as a country.
As I tell young people today, best damn country in the world. I got news for you. And to think that we Tuskegee Airmen helped to defeat the most evil society that the world has ever known. And we don't want it to ever rise again. Thank God it's gone.
Once again, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Jefferson.
Thank you.
American Airlines salutes Colonel Alexander Jefferson.
When we return to American Valor, a salute to our heroes. Ellie Kemper remembers a fallen hero of the Korean War.
Hi, I'm Dick Myers, and I am proud to serve as Honorary Chairman of the American Veterans Center. The American Veterans Center was founded by Vietnam veteran Jim Roberts to honor our veterans and to guard their legacy of service and sacrifice. The American Veterans Center accomplishes this mission through public events such as the National Memorial Day Parade, educational programs like our annual Veterans Conference, and Emmy-winning documentary programs. I invite you to join our team. Please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. Thank you very much.
Welcome back to Washington, D.C. and American Valor, a salute to our heroes. 5 years after World War II, young Americans were called on once more to serve halfway around the world. To share one of their stories, please welcome back Mrs. Margaret Brennan.
Sunday, June 25th, 1950. Backed by heavy artillery fire, North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel. Shortly after, U.S. forces arrived to defend their South Korean allies. The Korean War had just begun. 92,000 Americans were wounded in the Korean War. More than 36,000 were killed. Theirs was a sacrifice too often forgotten, too often fully appreciated only by their brothers who witnessed extraordinary valor. With a story of such extraordinary valor and sacrifice in Korea is Ellie Kemper.
November 2nd, 1950. Battle raged as a small band of U.S. soldiers desperately fought to hold off an overwhelming attack. Casualties mounted. Among the wounded was a young soldier, Sergeant First Class Herbert Miller, his ankle shattered by an enemy grenade. As he lay helpless in a ditch, he was spotted by a communist soldier. The soldier approached, raised his rifle to Miller's head, and prepared to fire. As he began to close his eyes, accepting his fate, Miller caught sight of a man rushing toward the enemy soldier. It was an American, a battlefield chaplain, who he'd never seen before. The chaplain pushed the rifle aside, then helped Miller to his feet, as the communist soldier watched in stunned silence. Father Emil J. Capon did not carry a weapon. He'd never fired a gun, yet had already earned a reputation for battlefield heroics as a chaplain in the United States Army. A veteran of World War II, Father Capon was among the first Americans ordered to Korea at the outbreak of war. A few months into the fighting, he was decorated with a Bronze Star for braving enemy fire to drag wounded soldiers to safety. Capon and Miller joined their captured comrades on a forced march north to a Korean prisoner camp. For miles, Father Capon carried Miller on his back, fully aware that the sergeant would be shot if he fell behind. And as men starved on tiny rations of corn and birdseed, Father Capon somehow found a way to sneak into nearby fields, returning with potatoes and rice. He soon earned himself a nickname, the Good Thief. One POW, Lieutenant Paul Roach, would later recall, "He saved my life just by the work he did over there. He gave me faith and inspired me to live." Another prisoner, Mike Dow, said, "I'll never doubt the power of prayer again. Father could not fail." Nor could he be broken. Ridiculed by the guards for his faith, he was stripped of his clothes and forced to stand in the cold. Yet at night, he would slip into the prisoners' huts, providing encouragement and leading them in prayer. But the brutal conditions took their toll. Father Capon grew thin and weak, was stricken with dysentery, then pneumonia. The guards ordered he be carried to the camp hospital. The men had another name for it, the death house. None who entered ever returned. The prisoners despaired, knowing what this meant for their beloved chaplain. Tears filling his eyes, Mike Dow begged him not to go. Father Capon's faith held firm. "Mike, don't be sad," he said. "I'm going where I always wanted to go, and when I get there, I'll be saying a prayer for you guys." Father Capon died on May 23, 1951, and was buried in a mass grave near the camp. His remains were never found. Decades later, Pope John Paul II named Father Capon a servant of God, the first step towards sainthood. Then, in 2013, at a ceremony at the White House, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded Father Emil Capon the United States military's highest award, the Medal of Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, two U.S. Army soldiers who witnessed the valor and humanity of Father Emil Capon in their prison camp in the Korean War. Please welcome to the stage Mike Dow and Paul Roach.
Mike, you witnessed Father Capon's valor firsthand as a prisoner of war. Tell us a little about the man.
He's actually the greatest man I've ever known. He was able to lead without commanding dramatically, but just by example and by being himself.
And Paul, were you aware that you were witnessing extraordinary heroism just by being with this man?
He was just that kind of man that everybody respected and loved him.
And Mike, you were there obviously when he was taken away. Take us back to that moment.
He said, don't fight for me, that he was going where he wanted to go. He'd take care of us when he got there.
In my mind, at least, he'll last forever. He was an amazing person. Everybody listened when he spoke, and everybody appreciated that.
Once again, Mike Dow and Paul Roach, witnesses to the valor and the sacrifice of the Medal of Honor recipient, Father Emil Capone.
When we return to American Valor, a salute to our heroes, Liam Neeson and James Madio honor one of the most highly decorated veterans of Vietnam.
American Valor, a salute to our heroes, presented by Northrop Grumman, is sponsored in part by Veterans United Home Loans, honored to serve those who serve, and by the Purple Heart Foundation, honoring their sacrifice with our service.
Welcome back to American Valor, a salute to our heroes from the Omni Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C. To introduce the story of one of the great heroes from the war in Vietnam, please welcome star of the famed series Band of Brothers, Mr. James Madio.
Welcome home. This seems the most natural greeting to offer service members returning from war. Today it's unthinkable to imagine anything less of our troops. And yet, it happened, and not that long ago. The controversy over the war in Vietnam spilled into every facet of American life. Honorable men answered their country's call, did not receive the welcome they had earned. Still, this was a generation that knew the meaning of sacrifice. The bonds that they had built on the battlefield were carried home, and they were determined to make sure that 58,000 Americans who died in Vietnam had not died in vain. And decades later, they are at the forefront to ensure that today's warriors receive their own welcome home. Sharing the story of one of the greatest heroes of Vietnam is Liam Neeson.
July 1st, 1964, the Republic of Vietnam. Major Charles Kelly, commander of the 57th Medical Detachment, call sign Dust-Off, sped his helicopter toward a combat zone. Several South Vietnamese and American soldiers had been wounded and requested immediate evacuation. Kelly had earned his nickname Madman for his aggressive flying, willing to brave the heaviest combat to save lives. He trained his pilots to evacuate patients in conditions never before attempted, at night, through bad weather, and in the midst of battle. As Kelly began his descent, his helicopter came under attack. Friendly forces on the ground screamed for him to evacuate, to save himself and his Huey. "When I have you wounded," he replied, unwilling to abandon his mission. A moment later, a single enemy bullet hit Charles Kelly in the chest, piercing his heart. With Major Kelly's death, command passed to his protege, U.S. Army Captain Patrick Henry Brady. The day following his death, a ranking officer tossed the bullet that had felled Kelly onto Captain Brady's desk, asking if the Dust-Off pilots would now stop flying so aggressively. Brady picked up the bullet and replied, "We are going to keep flying exactly the way Kelly taught us to fly, without hesitation, anytime, anywhere." Major Kelly's last words, "When I have you wounded," would serve as the unit's rallying cry. January 6, 1968. Now a seasoned pilot on his second tour in Vietnam, recently promoted Major Brady was awakened early for a mission to save 2 Vietnamese soldiers wounded deep in the mountains. Thick fog covered the terrain. Other aircraft had tried 7 rescue attempts. Each had failed. Now Major Brady got the call. Navigating his way beneath the fog, Brady followed a narrow road and valley stream directly to the wounded soldiers' position. As the soldiers were loaded into the Huey, he heard chatter through his radio. American casualties, nearly 70 of them, 20 kilometers upriver. The men were pinned down no more than 50 meters from the enemy position. Multiple unsuccessful rescue attempts had been made. Without hesitation, Major Brady loaded a medical team into his Huey and lifted off toward the Americans' position. Flying through the fog along a forest trail just above the ground, he passed right over a North Vietnamese Army unit, too stunned to react to the lone American medical helicopter. Locating the Americans, he loaded the wounded for evacuation. Back at the landing zone, men cheered as Brady's helicopter emerged from the fog. Immediately, he went back for more, and then again. On his third trip, his aircraft was hit by enemy fire, badly damaging its controls. Yet he kept flying, obtaining a replacement aircraft and heading into enemy lines a 4th time. A mine detonated as he evacuated a trapped platoon, hitting 2 of his crew and damaging his ship. Still, he was able to evacuate 6 more severely wounded soldiers to receive aid. In all, Brady and his crew saved nearly 60 wounded soldiers that day. At the time, amidst daily combat, the missions of January 6, 1968 seemed almost routine to Major Brady. The men who witnessed them disagreed. To them, Brady's actions were extraordinary and warranted the military's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. Patrick Brady would fly more than 2,500 combat missions in Vietnam, evacuating some 5,000 men from the battlefield. Under his leadership, Brady's pilots evacuated more than 21,000 wounded, both friendly and enemy. One of only 2 soldiers in Vietnam to be awarded the Medal of Honor and the Army's second highest award, the Distinguished Service Cross, Patrick Henry Brady would rise to the rank of Major General. And yet, despite his rank and distinction, in his dreams, he is still a young captain under the command of Major Kelly, strapping into the seat of his Huey and taking off through the fog for the missions that matter to him most, saving lives.
Please welcome one of the most highly decorated Americans of the Vietnam War, Medal of Honor recipient, Major General Patrick Henry Brady.
What inspired you, though, to fly so aggressively, really creating the doctrine for how rescue operations were conducted?
I think the mission that we were blessed to have, the dust-off people in Vietnam, was saving lives. It was just such a beautiful mission to have. So that was inspirational to all the dust-off pilots and crew.
And take us back to the mission for which you were awarded the Medal of Honor.
We came up against tremendous obstacles, weather, mountains, terrain, the enemy. We did not want to leave anyone on the battlefield. And I'm praying like crazy, and I had an epiphany. And the good Lord showed me how to get through the fog, day and night. And that was the final thing that we needed to be able to rescue everybody on the battlefield.
And what would you say is the legacy of your generation who served so honorably in Vietnam?
It was probably the first war up to that point in time, maybe ever, where the GI added to his heroism on the battlefield a humanitarianism that had not been seen. He was adopting children, he was vaccinating the children, he was building hospitals, he cared for and he cared about those people.
What an inspiration. Once again, Major General Patrick Henry Brady. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the United States Army Chorus, conducted by Major Leo Pena.
For the call, we place our trust in Thee.
When we return to American Valor, a salute to our heroes, Gary Sinise honors the inspiring story of a wounded warrior of today's generation.
Welcome back to American Valor, a salute to our heroes. Introducing one of the most inspiring stories of today's generation of heroes, please welcome back James Madio.
There is no glory in war. It is ugly, brutal business. It kills, it maims, it is a last resort and a result of the failings of mankind. None know this better than the soldier. They sacrifice their lives and bodies. Their families wait at home, half a world away, to worry whether they will ever return. And some who do return do not return the same. And yet there are none more worthy of our respect than the warriors who risk their lives for something larger than themselves. They do not ask for war, but when it comes, they stand ready. Perhaps most worthy of our admiration are the warriors who are returned broken from battle, but find it in themselves to carry on. Broken in body, but not in spirit, and find new ways to serve their country. With the story of a warrior and friend who rose from his wounds to carry on, this is Gary Sinise.
For Sergeant First Class Michael Schlitz, nothing could top serving as a U.S. Army Ranger. And from the moment he joined the Army, it was all he wanted out of life. He became a Ranger School instructor, tasked with molding the next generation of elite soldiers. When he was deployed to Iraq at the outset of the surge, Mike Schlitz welcomed yet another challenge, eager to prove himself among the Army's best. February 27th, 2007, Southwest Baghdad. 6 months into his deployment, Sergeant First Class Schlitz prepared to lead a mission to locate and disarm the roadside bombs that were the bane of U.S. forces in Iraq. The mission was routine. The soldiers rose early, then headed out for a 15-hour day on patrol. Leading the way were 4 heavily armored vehicles outfitted with metal detectors to locate hidden explosives. Bringing up the rear of the convoy in a lightly armored Humvee was Mike Schlitz, joined by his driver, Corporal Lorne Henry Jr., his gunner, Sergeant Richard Sukinka, and his medic, Sergeant Jonathan Cadavero. The sun had just begun to rise a few hours into their mission when the convoy approached a dead-end street. Reaching the end of the street, the convoy slowly turned, making its way back to the open road. As Schlitz's vehicle passed over the drainpipe, there was a sudden flash. A massive explosion rocked the Humvee. Insurgents had buried 2 artillery shells in a propane tank next to the underground drainpipe, making the IED undetectable. They'd waited until the Humvee was passing above to detonate the bomb. The blast knocked Schlitz from his vehicle. Upon hitting the ground, instinct kicked in, and he leapt to his feet to help his men. It was only as he neared the smoldering Humvee that he felt the flames that had engulfed his body. The heat unbearable, he fell to the ground in a desperate attempt to extinguish the flames. But covered in propane, the fire was too intense. He began to accept that he would die, here, face down, in the dirt of Iraq. His comrades in the Humvee had all been killed in the blast. Suddenly, a cool rush came over his body, as if he was hit with a wave of ice water. Soldiers from his convoy had rushed to his aid with a fire extinguisher. The agony of being burned alive was washed away by a peaceful calm, and a thought, maybe I've got a fighting chance. A medevac arrived, and Schlitz was loaded aboard. Then the morphine kicked in, and all went black. Mike Schlitz's fight was just beginning. Sergeant First Class Schlitz was evacuated to a military hospital for emergency surgeries in the secure green zone of Baghdad. He was then flown to hospitals in Germany, then to the States for additional surgeries. 10 times during these operations, his heart stopped beating, and 10 times his doctors brought him back. Now stabilized, but in a medically induced coma,
Mike was joined at his bedside by his mother, Robbie. Through dozens of surgeries over the next 4 months, Robbie wouldn't leave his side. Mike began to regain consciousness and to recognize the full extent of his wounds. He had lost both hands, with burns to 85% of his body. He was legally blind and couldn't walk. Thoughts of suicide crept into his mind and soon became an obsession. His mother would not leave his side, and his brothers in arms still regarded him as a fellow Ranger. 6 months following the attack in Iraq, his physical therapist came to him with a simple command. Today, we are going to stand. Soon it was, today, we are going to take one step. Eventually, Mike was fitted with prosthetics, and simple tasks were once again part of Mike's life. With those simple tasks came hope. And along the way, Mike Schlitz, Army Ranger, found a new mission, a new purpose. In the years following his injuries, he began to tell his story. He spoke out on the scourge of suicide afflicting the veterans of his generation. He embraced his new life, one that was no longer dedicated to just himself, but to helping others. More than a decade has passed. Since that time, he's undergone more than 90 surgeries. Throughout his inspired recovery, he has dedicated himself to living a life that would make his lost brothers proud. By living such a life, he has achieved that, and so much more.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome U.S. Army Ranger Sergeant First Class Michael Schlitz.
Knowing how much you love being an Army Ranger, what was your initial reaction to what happened?
When I first got told I was injured, I was already almost 6 months into my recovery, coming out of the medically induced coma. Things were a little foggy, but I couldn't believe it because I remember the day I was injured up until the point where they put me in that medically induced coma. It was just a shock. And over time, luckily, having my mother and my brother and family members there, they helped guide that and make it a little easier for me.
And what message would you bring to fellow warriors who are also, dealing with very challenging injuries and this sort of thing?
I think if I had to give one message, it's not just for people who were wounded in combat or injured in training, or even those who are now fighting other battles, cancer and other illnesses that face you as you get older. I would say just don't give up hope. 10 and a half years ago when I got blown up, I never dreamt that I'd be standing up here and accomplish the things I've accomplished over the last several years. And so if I would have given up hope, I tell you, I probably wouldn't be standing up here. So I take it to the community around me to help me and push me towards my goals. Just don't lose hope.
Amazing, what a message. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, Sergeant First Class Mike Schlitz.
When we return to American Valor, a salute to our heroes, Diane Lane and Carolina Kakova honor a trailblazing pilot on and off the battlefield. American Valor, a salute to our heroes, presented by Northrop Grumman, is sponsored in part by Veterans United Home Loans, honored to serve those who serve, and by Our Veterans Deserve the Best, the coalition to salute America's heroes, provided daily with emergency aid and support. Learn more at saluteheroes.org.
Welcome back to American Valor, a salute to our heroes. Joining us to introduce a story of courage both on and off the battlefield, please welcome actress and Victoria's Secret supermodel and also proud spouse of a United States Marine, Mrs. Carolina Kakova.
It is no secret why the United States military is the most effective fighting force in the history of the world. It is a microcosm of America, an institution that requires teamwork and a self-sacrifice. It also prizes the individual. the individual thought, individual initiative, and individual talent. The United States military, like America, is always striving to become the best version of itself. And though imperfect, from its beginning it has been an institution that allowed the talent to rise, to prove itself, to enable those who can meet its exacting standards to shine. This is why there is no greater American institution than our military. If you can face its challenges, if you can meet its standards, you can earn the opportunity to wear the uniform. It is a place where talent combined with opportunity allow Americans to accomplish the extraordinary. With the story of a pilot who proved just that, it's Diane Lane.
On July 29, 2009, 2 U.S. Air Force medevac helicopters raced across the Afghan sky, desperate to reach 3 Americans critically wounded outside Kandahar. Seated in the left-hand pilot seat of the lead helo, with call sign Pedro 15, was Air Force Major Mary Jennings. This mission was all too familiar for Major Jennings. An Army convoy had been hit by an IED, the soldiers pinned down by an enemy ambush. As Pedro 15 cleared a ridge, the charred wreckage of the convoy could be spotted below, the troops pinned down by Taliban fire. On cue, the helo swung around to drop its Air Force para-rescuemen, nicknamed PJs, to aid the wounded. Just as the PJs cleared the helicopter, there was a loud crack as the windshield of Pedro 15 shattered in front of Major Jennings' eyes. Her arm felt warm and wet. She'd been hit, with shrapnel peppering her arm and thigh. Though bleeding, Major Jennings assured her comrades that she could still fly, and Pedro 15 swung back around to land. The wounded soldiers had to be evacuated immediately. There was no choice but to brave the enemy fire. The wounded loaded aboard. Pedro 15 took off. But seconds later, the smell of gas filled the cabin as Major Jennings watched the fuel gauge drop dangerously fast. Enemy machine gun bullets had hit the helicopter's fuel line. The pilots were forced to make a hard landing on a rocky ridge, still dangerously close to Taliban forces. Major Jennings grabbed her rifle, climbed out of the wounded helo, and waited for the attack that was sure to come. Within minutes, bullets began to ricochet off the rocks along the ridge below. Taliban fighters were pressing closer. The situation dire. The emergency radio channel crackled with a message from a nearby Army helicopter. The pilot had a plan. 2 Army helos would swing down and pick up Major Jennings and 3 other crew members. The second medevac helo circling above, Pedro 16, would follow, evacuating those remaining. The catch was, there were no extra seats on the Army helicopter. MJ and her comrades would need to stand on the helo's skids, hanging onto the side. Looping her belt around the helicopter's rocket mount, MJ watched for the enemy as the helo took to the air. Suddenly, off in the distance, she noticed a flash, the muzzle of a Taliban rifle firing at the downed crew. Mary Jennings began squeezing off rifle rounds at the Taliban position, standing on the skids of her helicopter as it took to the skies. Her quick action bought the helo precious seconds to take off and evacuate to base. In the end, the Americans were all safely evacuated, due in no small part to the actions of Major Mary Jennings. She would soon return home, marry childhood friend Brandon Hagar, and prepared to apply to become a special tactics officer. Yet, she was forbidden to even apply. The military's ground combat exclusion policy banned women from frontline combat. This came as news to Major Jennings, who had already seen her share of combat. And so, for Mary Jennings Hagar, one option remained: change the policy. On November 27, 2012, she became the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Secretary of Defense. The lawsuit argued that women were not only serving with distinction as combat pilots, but battlefield commanders were already finding ways to get them on the front lines for sensitive duties interacting with other women. And in the American tradition, any job should be made available to whoever could best fill it, regardless of age, race, or gender. The Secretary of Defense agreed. At a press conference 2 months later, he announced that the military's ban on women in combat roles was over. If they could do the job, they could not be denied the opportunity. Along with the Purple Heart, Major Mary Jennings Hagar would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor for her actions in Afghanistan. She is only the second woman in U.S. military history to receive the decoration. Thanks to her service on and off the battlefield, she will not be the last.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Major Mary Jennings Hagar.
So what goes through your mind when you're on a mission like the one we just actually heard about?
Your world becomes very small, and it is encompassed only in the men and women that you're with. That day I was with some of the best men that I've ever flown in combat with, and my greatest fear was not, and a lot of the people in this room and watching on the AFN, I think, can understand this sentiment, that my greatest fear was not dying or getting shot again. It was that I would not do everything to the utmost of my ability to save the brothers that I was serving with. So that was the number one goal, was to serve my country and my brothers with honor.
And you're one of only 2 women to have received the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor. What does it mean to receive such a distinction?
It means that a lot of women have been under-recognized for their their efforts and their valiant. It was alluded to during the Korean War segment that I think a lot of the men and women who have served in combat, when they hear words like extraordinary valor and heroism, I think what we mean when we say it's not extraordinary is that for me it was ordinary. I'm being honored for things that I was seeing men and women do on a daily basis during my 3 tours in Afghanistan.
So inspiring. And what would you say to young girls who'd like someday to follow in your footsteps?
Probably the same thing I would say to young men, and to both I would say, don't ever let someone tell you what you can and can't do. That's for you to decide and you to figure out. There is no failure as long as you're continuing to try.
What a message. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, Major Mary Jennings Hagar.
Northrop Grumman salutes Major Mary Jennings Hagar for her honor and valor on and off the battlefield.
When we return to American Valor, a salute to our heroes, Mel Gibson honors a recipient of the Medal of Honor from today's military.
Welcome back to American Valor, a salute to our heroes from the Omni Shoreham Hotel here in Washington, D.C. Joining Carolina Kokova to introduce the story of a hero from today's military, please welcome her husband and Marine Corps veteran of the Gulf War, Archie Drury.
Since the onset of operations in Afghanistan, 14 men have been awarded the Medal of Honor. The first was awarded for extraordinary valor by a Navy SEAL officer on June 28, 2005. Deep in the mountains, his 4-man team surrounded. Lieutenant Michael P. Murphy braved enemy fire to get into a position where he could call his base for help.
Murphy knew the consequences of his actions, but he took them anyway, to save his fellow SEALs, to save his friends. Though shot through the chest, he made that call. His last words before falling were, "Roger that, thank you, sir." The Medal of Honor is not about one man. The men who wear it do so in honor of those who served, those who sacrificed alongside them.
Sharing the story of an heir to the valor of Lieutenant Murphy, another recipient of the Medal of Honor in Afghanistan, is Mel Gibson.
Kunar Province, eastern Afghanistan near the Pakistani border, August 8, 2012. 5 soldiers from the U.S. Army's Task Force Mountain Warrior stepped out from their forward operating base. The mission was routine: provide a security escort for 7 senior U.S. and Afghan Army officers en route to a weekly security meeting at the provincial governor's compound nearby. Leading the security team was a 29-year-old U.S. Army captain, Florent Ahmed Groberg, nicknamed Flo, serving his second tour in Afghanistan. Born outside of Paris, he was raised by his French-Algerian mother and adopted American stepfather. When Flo was in middle school, the family moved to the United States. Shortly before graduating high school in 2001, Flo became a naturalized United States citizen. Like so many who came before him, Florent Groberg wanted to give something back to the adopted home that had given him so much. And so after graduating college, he became an officer in the United States Army. Flo proved a natural soldier and leader, and by the mission of August 8, 2012, the men of his team had grown to trust each other completely. Intelligence reports suggested heightened threats, and so the team proceeded with caution toward the compound. As they approached the small bridge, 2 motorcycles came speeding toward the patrol, which was supplemented by about a dozen Afghan soldiers. It was an ambush. At that moment, a lone man crept from a nearby building, slowly backing toward the patrol. The Afghan soldiers rushed to flag down the motorcycles, which soon turned and sped away, a diversion. Captain Groberg noticed the man approaching the patrol as the Afghan soldiers were distracted. He yelled at him to stop. The man turned, staring at the patrol with blank eyes, most likely drugged to numb his fear, then started straight at Flo and the officers he was guarding. Without hesitation, Captain Groberg rushed at the man, blocking him across the chest with his rifle. He felt a bulky vest under the man's clothes, a suicide bomb. Instinctively, Groberg grabbed the vest, throwing the man away from the patrol. His comrade, Sergeant Andrew Mahoney, rushed to his aid as they drove the man into the ground. With a flash, the suicide bomber detonated his vest. The blast sending thousands of ball bearings in every direction and knocking Groberg some 15 feet away and wounding Mahoney. The blast startled a second suicide bomber who had been hiding inside a nearby building, who detonated his bomb before he could attack the patrol. Coming to seconds later, his leg shattered and covered in his own blood and the blood of his attacker, Captain Groberg grabbed his pistol and began dragging himself out of the kill zone. Though bleeding out and expecting a follow-up attack, he was determined to remain at his post. Suddenly, his platoon sergeant appeared, grabbing the wounded captain by his body armor and dragging him to a nearby ditch. A tourniquet was applied to his leg, saving his life. As he was carried toward an armored truck to be evacuated from the field, he continued to direct his men. As he was loaded into the truck, a senior NCO looked him in the eyes and said, "Sir, I've got this. You're done." The door closed, the pain set in, and all went black as Captain Groberg was rushed to the first of what would be nearly 3 dozen surgeries to save his leg. The men who served with Captain Florent Groberg knew they had witnessed extraordinary heroism that day. And yet, as with so many heroes, Captain Groberg's valor came on what he'd remember as the worst day of his life, as 4 of his brothers in arms were killed in the blast. Among them were Command Sergeant Major Kevin Griffin, Major David Gray, Major Tom Kennedy, and Regai Abdel Fattah. It was their story, their sacrifice, that Captain Groberg asked his countrymen to remember when on November 12, 2015, President Obama awarded him the United States military's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. The medal recognized the valor and sacrifice of a soldier, an American by choice, who, in seeking to give back to a home that had given him so much, in turn became one of its greatest heroes.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Medal of Honor recipient, Captain Florent Groberg.
What originally inspired you to join the military?
So, I came from a different country, France, and my mom is French-Algerian, and my uncle was fighting the terrorist organization when really nobody else was talking about terrorism in this country back in early 90s. And He was killed in action in 1996, and that really paved the way for me to really understand what I wanted to do in my life. And the actions on terrible tragedy actually on 9/11 really cemented my mindset and my path.
And what would be your message to your fallen comrades?
I miss them. I miss them, and I trade places with them any single day, and that I will do everything that I can in my power to honor them. They gave me an opportunity to still be on this earth. They serve our nation with their best of their abilities. There are our heroes. I do not consider myself a hero at all. So I consider myself a service member and a member of the team, and that every single breath that I take on this earth, every single morning that I wake up and I look at myself in the mirror and Carson tells me to brush my teeth, believe it or not, it's not just your mother, your fiance too, that I make a commitment to be a better person and to honor the fact that I'm still on this earth breathing while they're not. And I hope that their families and they, at the end, look at me and say that I earned it.
And today's generation of American soldiers are so impressive. What do you think it is that makes them so effective?
We have an opportunity to make decisions on our own. We're lucky. But honestly, it's one of those things where we're standing up. We're standing up against hatred. We want to make sure that we, as a generation, continue to pave the way for our future generations, just like they did for us, to make sure that we get to continue living the way that we should be living as free.
An inspiration of a man. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, Captain Florent Groberg.
The Purple Heart Foundation salutes Medal of Honor recipient from the war in Afghanistan, Captain Florent Groberg.
When we return to American Valor, a salute to our heroes, Mike Rowe and George Clooney salute two of the most iconic moments of the last 75 years of American history. American Valor, a salute to our heroes, presented by Northrop Grumman, is sponsored in part by American Airlines, proud to be the official airline of American Valor, a salute to our heroes, and by Wounded Paw Project, saving a paw to save a life.
Welcome back to American Valor, a salute to our heroes. Our final two stories span nearly 70 years of American history. Both were heroes of the air, taking calculated risks to achieve the impossible. And both inspired Americans like few stories in history. To introduce these stories once again, James Badgedale.
Throughout American history, it is our darkest moments that heroes rise. Years of training meet split-second decisions, which in some cases change the course of history. Amid the devastation of Pearl Harbor and defeat after defeat, a band of pilots took to the skies in an impossible mission to change the momentum of World War II. The mission was to fly unescorted Army bombers into enemy territory and hit the heart of the Japanese Empire. Briefed on their mission, the pilots and their crews were told it could be a one-way trip. Each was given the choice to back out, and they went anyway. Their mission proved to be more than a success. It rallied the nation in ways none thought possible. The darkness of Pearl Harbor was past, and now there was hope. 75 years ago, April 18th, 1942, 80 men on 16 bombers changed history. Their story, now legendary, has inspired generations since and will continue to inspire generations to come. Sharing the story of the 80 men of one of the most legendary moments in American history and their sole living survivor is Mike Rowe.
There are moments, and there are men, that galvanize a nation and change history. The weeks following the attack on Pearl Harbor were met with disaster for the United States and the Pacific theater of World War II. Ships were sunk, planes were lost, and troops were forced to surrender. Morale among the military and Americans at home was astoundingly low. Just before Christmas, 1941, President Roosevelt told the Joint Chiefs to find a way to strike back at Japan as soon as possible, to prove to the Imperial Japanese and to Americans that they were not invincible. The mission would not be easy. Some thought it impossible. The American fleet was reeling, and Japan's defenses were strong. U.S. Army bombers would need to be specially outfitted not only to launch from aircraft carriers, but to have sufficient range to fly over Japan and on to safety in China. Only one man could be trusted to plan such a mission: the military's best engineer, the famous test pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. On April 18, 1942, Doolittle and his co-pilot, Richard E. Cole, led 16 B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet toward Japan. Each of the 80 men who flew with Doolittle knew that this could be a suicide mission. Not only did they face Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, after being spotted, they were forced to launch their planes 200 miles early. Even if they made it to Japan, there was now no guarantee they would have enough fuel to reach safety in China. All 16 bombers reached Japan, hitting military targets in Tokyo and several other cities. Short on fuel, each of the crews were forced to bail out or crash land their planes. One landed in Russia, where its crew was interned. 3 men died evacuating their planes. 8 were captured by the Japanese and held prisoner. 3 were executed, and 1 died in captivity. The rest of the raiders regrouped and made their way to safety. Doolittle himself thought the raid a failure. Having caused minimal damage and losing all of his planes, he expected to be court-martialed. Little did Doolittle and his men know that the raid had caused a sensation back home. Morale shot through the roof as the American public, reeling from defeat after defeat, watched as the U.S. military had struck at the heart of the Japanese Empire. Just as important, the Japanese military, shocked by the attack, reorganized its defenses, diverting material to defend the home islands. This would have tremendous impact 2 months later, as the entire tide of the war would shift in the Americans' favor following the epic Battle of Midway. Jimmy Doolittle would receive the Medal of Honor for leading the raid on Tokyo. Each of the 79 other raiders were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders would go down in history among the most legendary veterans of the Second World War. 80 men took part in the Doolittle Raid. 62 would survive World War II. As the years passed, so did the Doolittle Raiders, with Doolittle himself passing away in 1993. 75 years after the raid, only one survives: Doolittle's co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Richard E. Cole, the last witness to an impossible mission that changed the course of a war and defined a generation.
Ladies and gentlemen, the co-pilot of Jimmy Doolittle, the last of the 80 legendary Doolittle Raiders, at 102 years of age, please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Richard E. Cole.
What an honor to have you here tonight. But you and your fellow Raiders were given the chance to back out once you were told about this top secret mission, but nobody did back out. What does it mean to you to be representing one of the legendary moments in military history?
At that point in time, Jimmy Doolittle was the man of the hour. He had our belief and trust, and it was time to strike, and we would follow him anywhere.
Ladies and gentlemen, we truly are in the presence of a legend. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Cole. Thank you so much.
75 years. The story of Jimmy Doolittle and the Doolittle Raid has inspired pilots of the United States Air Force like few stories in history. It was the ultimate demonstration of training, skill, and quick decisions under intense pressure that created a band of heroes and made Doolittle a household name. That same devotion to training and skill continued in new generations of pilots. Nowhere was it more evident than in another story of heroism in the air, nearly 7 decades after the Doolittle Raid, which rallied the nation like few stories since. Like Doolittle, its leader became a household name, a veteran of the United States Air Force whose training, skill, and decisions under pressure led to one of the most spectacular moments in modern American history. And like Doolittle, his actions inspired a new generation of Americans, rallying the country when it needed it most. Sharing the story of one of the great unifying moments in modern American history is George Clooney.
All was normal as U.S. Airways Flight 1549 lifted off from LaGuardia Airport. First Officer Jeff Skiles at the controls just before 3:26 p.m., January 15th, 2009. Morning snow had given way to a cold, clear day, offering magnificent views of the New York skyline and Hudson River as the jet rose over the Bronx, climbing to 1,000 feet. Out of nowhere, a flock of geese appeared, smashing into the nose and wings of the aircraft. Most ominously, they flew into the engines, which strained to stay in operation before losing thrust completely. The airplane in crisis, control was shifted to its captain, Chesley B. Sullenberger. A graduate of the Air Force Academy, Sullenberger's career began as a fighter pilot 35 years earlier. His military training and lessons learned since would show themselves in the most dangerous 3.5 minutes of his career. Within seconds, Sullenberger radioed Mayday to air traffic control, declaring an emergency. The engines would not start, and the plane was losing speed, descending at a rate of 2 stories a second. Gliding over the George Washington Bridge, Sullenberger cycled through his options. With the plane's rapid descent, only one option remained.
We're going to be in the Hudson. 210-2718. I think he said he was going in the Hudson.
New Yorkers were preparing for the afternoon rush as thousands on both sides of the Hudson looked on to watch the Airbus A320 glide into the river with a splash. Onlookers were even more shocked as passengers began to calmly exit the floating airplane, standing on its wings and in rafts. Last to exit was its captain, after all had been evacuated. Within minutes, a New York waterway ferry pulled alongside the plane and began to evacuate passengers from the icy water. Soon it seemed as if all of New York and all of New Jersey were rushing to the middle of the Hudson. A few hours later, incredible news was confirmed. All 155 souls aboard were safe and accounted for. The story of Flight 1549 and its pilots captivated the nation. Sully Sullenberger was hailed as a hero. He had not chosen the moment had chosen him. It was merely a culmination of decades of training, dedication to detail, and devotion to duty. The 5-minute flight of 1549, its pilots, crew, and the armada that came to their rescue inspired a city still scarred from September 11th and a country suffering the worst recession in 70 years. At a time in our nation's history when we all needed it, it gave us hope.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome United States Air Force fighter pilot veteran Captain Sully Sullenberger.
So in a moment of crisis like this, do you actually have time to think, or is it all just training and instinct at that stage?
We had to make time to think. You know, we didn't have time to reinvent the wheel. You have to realize this is something we had never specifically trained for. The only training we'd ever gotten for a water landing was a classroom discussion. So I had to have already done the hard work and created a paradigm about how to set priorities and solve any problem in an airplane. Probably the best way of explaining it is that for 42 years before this flight, I'd been making small, regular deposits in a bank of education, training, and experience. And on January 15, 2009, the balance was sufficient. I could make a sudden large withdrawal.
Your actions that day at the Miracle on the Hudson have given you a platform to really talk about the importance of safety in aviation. Tell us a little about that.
You know, when our first officer that night, Jeff Skiles, and I first realized when we got at the inauguration here in Washington 5 days after the flight, that unlike most news stories, this one was not going to fade away at the end of the news cycle. We both immediately felt an intense obligation to use this sudden notoriety for good, to be the de facto spokespersons for our profession, for our passengers. And that mission continues still. That not to do so would be a dereliction of duty.
Flight 1549 has so many parallels with the Doolittle Raid. Both succeeded due to intense training and fast, smart decisions. Both united and inspired the country during tough times. What does it mean to you to be the face of such a moment?
During the 2008-2009 worldwide financial meltdown, America felt like it needed a win, and this event gave them hope.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, one of the most iconic moments in American history, the great Captain Sully Sullenberger.
Thank you.
When American Valor, a salute to our heroes, concludes, a special closing tribute to a man, a mission, and a generation that saved the world.
American Valor, a salute to our heroes, presented by Northrop Grumman, is sponsored in part by Veterans United Home Loans, honored to serve those who serve. American Valor is produced by the American Veterans Center, guarding the legacy and honoring the sacrifice of American heroes of every generation. To learn more, visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org.
Welcome back to American Valor, a salute to our heroes. On April the 18th, 1943, the first anniversary of the Doolittle Raid, Jimmy Doolittle gathered the surviving raiders that were stationed with him in North Africa for an impromptu reunion. There, using coffee cups filled with champagne, they toasted their fallen brothers. The reunions continued after World War II, and every April the 18th, the surviving Doolittle raiders would gather to raise a toast to those who had passed since their last reunion. In a solemn ceremony, the goblets of the lost raiders would be turned over in their wooden carrying case. For half a century, the men of the Doolittle Raid held on to that bottle, vowing only to open it when the last few raiders survived in one final toast. It was more than just a bottle of cognac. It was a symbol of 80 brothers, bound together in history by a moment and by a mission. The bottle and their final toast would be their last farewell. 4 years ago, led by Colonel Cole, they gathered one final time. And after many decades, they opened that bottle of 1896 Hennessy, toasting their comrades. Today, one survives. A symbol of not just 80 men and one mission, but a symbol of millions of Americans who stood to fight in the Second World War. Colonel Cole, as you offered a toast to your lost brothers, tonight we're going to offer a toast for you. Tonight, each one of us will join together to commemorate one of the legendary moments in military history. we will honor the valor of Jimmy Doolittle and all the 79 raiders who have passed. We will honor what they stood for and the generation that stood with them when the world needed them most. And Lieutenant Colonel Cole, we will honor you. Your legacy of American valor will live on. So please stand with me for the toast to Lieutenant Cole, the legendary Doolittle Raiders, and generations of American valor. This has been an incredible night of incredible stories from our shared history. And I hope what you've heard this evening will stay with you and remind you of the valor, honor, courage, and sacrifice of our military men and women of every generation. Thank you, God bless, and good night.